Yantiv. Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me in the front? It was the end of May, the month of May this past year, right after Shabbat. Something like that happened. And I jumped in a taxi to go to the airport for an out-of-the-ordinary trip. And this time I was alone, I was without my family, flying over the Atlantic. And just 20 hours later, I was driving through the back roads of Normandy, France, in my rental car. Just this beautiful area, an area of France I'd never been to. Tall green grasses, wet with rain, on the corners of fields or jutting onto the edges of the road. Felt like England. Remember, the sun was setting. Even in my jet-lagged state, there was a wonderful peacefulness to the moment. And I was going to visit a friend, a very special friend of mine. Maimonides, the Spanish medieval rabbi, speaks about 3 different levels of friendship. Maimonides, who likes to categorize everything, right? Birth and death, everything in between, into neat little categories. And so the first level of friendship, he says, are friends somewhat of convenience, friends who are there at specific periods of our lives. We develop a friendship because we each derive some kind of benefit from our time together, our shared circumstance. And so we connect. But, he says, when those shared circumstances are no longer in place, then the friendship fades. And then there's another level of friendship that Maimonides speaks of. And that's when there's a benefit that transcends that moment or that place. We receive so much from each other at such a profound level, and we connect deeply. And so it carries on. Even after those shared circumstances have ended, we continue to be in touch because we continue to receive from the other person. And those friendships can be for many years, a whole life, says Maimonides. But then there's a third level of friendship, and it's exceedingly rare. We only have a few of these throughout our lives, if we are fortunate. And these are friends that we, so to speak, share a life mission with. We have an experience of walking the world for the same purpose. And this he calls a spiritual friendship. We walk together on all the paths of life. And it transcends. It's not about receiving, it's not about giving, it's about that conversation that never ends, altogether beyond the confines and contours of regular life. So I was visiting such a friend in Normandy, someone that I had grown up with. He was my best friend as a child. Met him just a few years after my family moved from Israel to the south of France. Normandy is up in the north. And I heard that there was this new family in the neighborhood. They just moved in. They were just across the street from us, and somehow I heard there was a boy my age who was part of this family. And he was like me. He was from the city. This was that period of my life. I lived in the countryside. Everybody else had grown up in the countryside, was from the countryside. But even more, he was also born in the Middle East. His father had been in the French military and was what's called a pied noir, a blackfoot, a name for all the ethnic French people who had lived during colonial times in Algeria and then left after independence. And he'd taken the whole family with him to Saudi Arabia, which was where my friend was born. And so my friend ended up going to a Catholic school, and we were not school friends, we were after-school friends, which is often better. And we spent our childhoods just wandering the hills and the forests where we grew up. And he was very French, but curious and more open and curious about our North American and Israeli backgrounds. And he didn't laugh when we do our Hebrew rituals at Shabbat. And he really became part of our family. And so when we were teenagers, our family moved away. We moved to India for what should have been 3 years, but was only 6 months. He moved to a different city in France. And when I came back, they were gone. So we drifted away, and I went to college. He went to the French army. And he became one of those people that we only see every number of years, caught up a little bit, an old friend, our lives in such different places. One day I remember he reached out to me, my old childhood friend was going through a crisis. I did my best to help. And I told him about my own journey to the rabbinate. And then when I was a student rabbi in France, serving some of the conservative congregations, including in Paris where he lived, we connected and we met at a cafe. It had been many years since we'd actually seen each other. And he said to me he was surprised the way I looked. I wasn't dressed more like a character from a French movie called Rabbi Jacob, which is where most French people learn everything they know about Jewish people from. One of the great French comedic actors, Louis de Funès, who plays a Hasidic Rebbe who is escaping from robbers. And so my friend was impressed. I looked fairly normal. And he had his wife with him and his daughter, and it was a joyous moment. And a few years later, we spoke a few times after I got married to Rachel. Then I started to see on Facebook all these pictures of him in the hospital. These pictures have become one of his calling cards, just his legs and his socks on a hospital bed with lots of comments of support from friends. I knew he was going through something. And then I saw his head without hair. I was worried. And yet he seemed positive throughout all those posts. I once heard about colonoscopy friends. That is, among men, when we reach a certain age, who are your friends who will take you to the colonoscopy and stay there and then take you back? Right? That's a certain level of friendship too. There are whole books about it. Who are those friends? Really, even this morning, 8:55 a.m. when we started our service, one of the first prayers we say are me'anachnu. Who are we? What are our lives? Who are our friends? It says our preeminence over beasts is negligible. That's one of the things we think about. Who are our friends? What are those things that make us more than a beast? Where are they? How do we find them? So 2 years later, around Hanukkah, out of nowhere, I got a chat from my friend. He was in dire straits. The cancer was a lot more serious than I'd ever realized, and it just spread to his brain. And he had a tumor, and he needed surgery. He was going to have it the very next day. He said his whole morale had plunged, and he felt he was going to leave his family, his wife and his daughter, alone in the world. What could he do? And suddenly he just got very deep, and he started to tell me his theory about his life, that he'd always felt protected somehow, but now he couldn't feel it anymore. I never heard him speak in that way, but now it's all suddenly coming out. And he just said, kind of aside, well, wouldn't it be great if you could come? So, I, as a person of faith, one of my oldest friends, believing the universe puts things in your lap for a reason, that the constellations sometimes arrange themselves for a certain mazel, a certain fate, asking me in this context, what could I do? And so I got on the plane while my wife Rachel graciously was okay with watching our 3-year-old and 1-year-old at the time by herself. And I got there to the hospital right before his surgery the next day in Paris. And he couldn't believe it. Surprised. And I saw him right before they took him away for surgery, and I think it brought him a little something, a comfort to see his old friend who turned up. But I really spent most of that time with his wife while he was in the hospital, the surgery and the post-surgery, and I really learned how horrible the past few years had been. And he had an exceedingly rare type of cancer for someone his age. In fact, he was the youngest person in all of France to get this type of cancer. And he'd been through intense surgery and many rounds of chemo and radiation in his 30s. And his health and vitality had been sapped for endless months and so much suffering. And everything had gone bad. Both he and his wife had been in the French army and had been deployed abroad. And they had to return to France. And their daughter had had a horrible experience with a caretaker and was not in good shape either. Not a good period. So I left a few days later. So at the beginning of Yom Kippur, when we ask ourselves these questions, what are our lives about? Whom are our people? And we try to take it deeper. What are we doing here? What is there to life? What is it all about? What is important? And what do we do in the most powerful and the most precarious times in our lives? And Yom Kippur takes us to that place. We don't eat, we don't drink. We have this custom of wearing white, like angels, or like the shrouds, the tachrichim that we are buried in. In the time of the temples, the high priest on Yom Kippur would prepare for a whole week before, reminding himself first of all the rituals he had to do, and then he would approach the Holy of Holies, the holiest place, the holiest time, the holiest person. And as we teach, if he wasn't ready, then he would die in that encounter with holiness, with the divine encounter, with the oneness, the source of all life. But if he was ready, then he would emerge and he would bless the multitudes of people with an impossible, tremendous blessing, a taste of the return to wholeness that each one of us seeks. And they would fall on their face. Right? He would enter alone and he would have, as legend says, a string around his ankle so they could pull him out if anything happened. And so he did go alone into the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctum, the heart of the world. But there were those who accompanied him along the way. First it was his family, his wife, his children, that the Mishnah calls his house. And then he would separate from them a week before, and he'd spend that week in the temple with the priest. And as the Mishnah puts it, some of the younger priests would click their fingers at him to keep him awake all night on the final night. And the elders would meet with him, and the dignitaries and the wise souls, his fellow priests, on Yom Kippur. There's a whole series of teachings in the Talmud and the Mishnah, our sources of rabbinic wisdom and understanding, about accompanying our fellows. Because the rabbis foresaw the loneliness of life, and they planned how to remedy it and how to help people through all the pains and struggles aggravated by exile and oppression. And so the Mishnah Torah by Maimonides states it clearly in the laws of mourning: the bringing joy to a bride and groom and helping them with all their needs, or accompanying a guest to the door after a visit when they leave, or carrying a corpse on one's shoulder, walking before the bier. It says these are the deeds of kindness that carries one upwards, mitzvot that have no limit. And although they are not found explicitly in the Torah, Maimonides states, they are all included in the Torah's command, love your neighbor as yourself. Because we are one, because he or she, everyone, is your own self. So after the Hanukkah trip, my friend reached out to me. He wanted to go to Israel. And so we decided to go together with our families. And I think he was grateful for surviving the surgery, and he wanted to see the Holy Land and feel more of that space he talked about, explore that feeling of being protected. And he put his whole heart into this trip. And this time I really got to see him. It wasn't just seeing our long-lost childhood friend that was trying to build anew. And he told me how he saw everything that happened in his life and all this illness. And in French, the word he used is called poisse, which means rotten luck or bad fortune, a bad sort. And it comes from a medieval French word, pois, a kind of glue. It sticks it to you. You can't get rid of it, poisse. And so he said everything always went bad for him. He never smoked or drank, but he got a rare kind of esophageal cancer in his 30s. And in all the years since I'd seen him, he'd had more lives than cats. He told me in the army as a head mechanic on a plane that was in the air one day, the plane suddenly caught fire and both engines died, and the plane started to come down close to base. And down on the ground there was an alarm, and his wife, who was working at the base, ran to the runway, and somebody told you it's your husband that's up on the plane. And somehow, using his quick thinking and his calm skills, he was able to repair the plane in the air at the last moment. Why it happened, nobody knew. Or once on a mission in an old French colony in Africa, he was working as a peacekeeper, and suddenly they were attacked by a large group of militants. And they had to run away, but they were pursued, and the militants were bent on killing them, and they kept trying to get away through streets and ran, but no luck. And then finally, out of nowhere, a large group of women, literally in their dresses, protected the peacekeepers, surrounded them, and helped him be ushered away to transportation and lifted out. So La Poisse, he said, he added, but also being watched over. And he added, I also feel watched over when I'm with your family. And so we danced at the Kotel at the Western Wall, letting go spiritually and singing and joined by many Hasidim that night. And he danced with us. And then at the Friday night meal afterwards, he made a speech about how important our family was to him. He told us the disease was back. Then his wife said, well, this is what he does now. He just makes everyone cry all the time. He said they gave him a special new calling card of an old storyteller who comes and shares about life. And then it clicked for me. It made me think of all the people that I just caught a glimpse of on Facebook, all those social media posts, all those hundreds of people that he was rallying, bringing out the best in them, a whole community that felt just a special oneness because of his own openness and his courage and his staring fate in the face, fighting. It made everyone else feel united, far from all the usual petty things that define all of our relationships with others and with our own selves, even as he was the one that was carrying the load. And the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, taught that we should love our neighbor as our very own self, because we really are the same self. If your hand bangs the door, you don't put up a veil between yourself and your hand. You don't try and hit your hand because you're angry at it. And there is a special peace to walking in Jerusalem with friends. As the Psalms state, to all my brothers and friends, I wish you peace. For the sake of the house of Adonai our God, I seek the best for you. And so it felt like we were creating a new house for the Lord. And then the years went by and I only got glimpses on Facebook, so many friends writing to him and him making jokes, making light of it all. But round after round, I knew the cancer was coming back, chemo and radiation again. And he moved from Paris to Normandy, and I got another chat that he was not doing well. And he'd had this dream since childhood of being an artisan and learning one of those old trades, those old French trades that go back hundreds of years. And so he trained with a traditional artisan making copper weather vanes. The man was retiring, it was perfect, sold him a house in an old postcard village with a workshop. And he'd hoped he would change his luck. It was as that old Talmudic dictum, right? Mishaneh makom, mishaneh mazal. If you change your place, then you can change your fate, you can change your luck. So we do, right? We beat our chests, we contemplate our lives, we think, what are our lives? And we look for whatever we can to just change our lives, to steer our lives, certain aspects of them. Somehow if we can just steer the course of our fates. Since Rosh Hashanah, eating honey because we want it all to be so sweet. Preparing carrots and tzimis because we want a good gzerah, a good decree from the Hebrew word gezer. We want to try and steer our universe to find a new mazel, a new wonderful new luck. When my own family arrived to North America from Eastern Europe, and they were at the border agent, asked them what their name was, and their name was Glick. When you heard Glick, you just said Glick, luck in Yiddish. My great-grandparents said, yes, that's our new name. We'll take that one. But my friend, he got poisse again. He got rotten luck again, bad in luck. And he was really struggling. Nothing was working, worse than ever. The man who'd sold him the business and the workshop, the weather vane, who taught him the weather vane business, had cheated him financially. And his cancer was back. And he shared with me he had a despair he'd never felt before. Just a big hole that he felt was beckoning him, an incredible anxious fear. And nothing could get rid of it, he philosophized with me, but without the usual mental and courage and humor that he always spoke with before. And he just didn't know what to do, and his whole life was collapsing and he was driving everybody crazy. And then they discovered he had another brain tumor. Maybe that was pressing on all of his emotions. And they were about to operate. And so I went back to France, and I found myself in Normandy this past May. in the beautiful countryside, in a picturesque, perfect picture card village where he lived, quaint homes with high slanted roofs and wooden beams on the exteriors. And we really had time to talk again. His wife was trying to build her life, and his daughter was now thriving in a local countryside school. And he spoke about the incredibly supportive community they'd found in this village and the quality of life they had. And he also said he'd found, facing surgery just 2 days before he arrived, that he didn't want to die. He really was ready to fight again. But he was on the edge, and his health was so precarious, just slowly returning after surgery. And so he walked around his village slowly, very, very slowly, half his face puffed up with all the stitches on one side. But I could sense a tremendous courage that he had, just a real true warrior. And he treated the surgery and the cancer like it was nothing, just bad luck, bad fortune. Why him again? He just wanted to be treated normally. I just saw how everybody respected and everybody honored him. We went to the chocolate shop. What's a French village without a chocolate shop? And there everybody brightened up seeing him, and all the other shop owners, and then all the other young families that lived there. And we went to see his daughter do horseback riding, and all the moms, mainly the moms who were there. And everybody loved him. The whole village had fallen for his courage. And then we went to his workshop, and his weather vanes were beautiful. And we also went to a local hotel just off the main square where he'd also made a copper piece of art that was just incredibly beautiful. But he told me the end of work was actually boring. He had these high-end machines that did almost all the work, and customers were paying in the tuchas. And so we sat together in intimate conversation, and we spoke about what comes after life. This is the first time in all that journey of illness and pain that we actually spoke heart to heart about death. And he said he was a believer, and he asked about Judaism's belief. And I spoke about returning to oneness and about the tzchor ha'chaim, the bond of life, the life current of the universe that we pray in the El Malei Rachamim prayer that we return to, and to a love that we can barely imagine in the oneness. So with 1 day left to my trip, he had to travel to Paris to the hospital that was 2 or 3 hours away. And he said he would have to leave early in the morning to beat traffic. And he says, don't come. Why don't you spend a nice day in one of those coastal towns, the tourist towns, and see the ocean and visit the D-Day sites. It'll make you want to come back with your family. And I said, yes, yes, yes. But in the early morning, I woke up somehow, and I'd come all the way to be with him, so I went. We drove together in a taxi provided by the French health services. And a lot of the time we didn't speak, or we just chit-chatted about life in France and people struggling and nobody wanting to work, working class French frustration he and the driver were talking about. And the hospital was old. The back way looked like it was from before the war, these old underground tunnels, bomb shelter-like, until we got to the waiting room that was buzzing with people. And I waited for him to have his tests and to see his doctor. One of the teachings that the rabbi stressed the most about accompanying guests after they leave our houses is as they go out, that we should accompany them after they leave our house. We shouldn't just shut the door and say goodbye and lock our door, but one should go out and wait and wave at them as they walk down the street, and stay there until they're out of view, and only then should we return to the warmth of our own house. And the Mishnah Torah is explicit. It says, the reward one receives for accompanying guests is greater than all the others. And this is a statute which Abraham, our patriarch, instituted in the path of kindness which he would follow. He would feed wayfarers, he would provide them with drink and accompany them. And it says, showing hospitality for guests surpasses even receiving them, receiving the divine presence. As Genesis 18:3 states, and he, Abraham, saw, and behold, there were 3 people. And then accompanying them is greater even than showing them hospitality. And our sages said, whoever does not accompany them is considered as if he shed blood. The Zohar, our chief work of Jewish mysticism, states, when a person escorts his friend, he draws the divine presence, he draws the Shekhinah down, which cleaves to his friend and protects him. And because of this, one must be careful to escort a guest. So he came back from his visit and said, the doctor had said to him that he would have to have chemo again. And he told me chemo is the worst. The pain and the suffering, and it ends up lasting half a year between all the different parts. And you can't do anything. And he told me absolutely no more chemo. And he told the doctor again. And she asked him, well, when was your last treatment? He said, a year ago. And she answered, well, that's not so bad. Not so bad, he said. And so I went back the next day, and our contact ended, until I heard a week ago that his cancer is back again. This time it's in his lungs. We are on this world for a short time. We don't know how long. We all face the same fate. And it should teach us how to live with courage, with vulnerability, sharing deeply with the people we love, reaching out to old friends, pursuing dreams, being real and accepting them when they do not work out, sharing with others both the beauty and the struggles of our lives, and finding a place where we just feel taken care of and confident in our life and in our lot. And so I know my friend Joffrey feels some peace of mind because his wife and daughter are now in a supportive community and feel supported. And the toll on them has been so high. Why always me? Why always me? He kept asking me. I don't know, but I know how much he continues to teach me about strength, about courage, about friendship. The Hasidic Rabbi, the Maggid of Mezerich, teaches that everything in this life and everything in this universe is always seeking to return to its source. Just as water that evaporates and becomes rain and then goes back into the oceans. You throw up a ball and then it comes down again. We're always trying to return to our essence. He says it's like a magnet of infinite love, infinite compassion, infinite bliss pulling you toward it. So a student of my father is a rabbi, a teacher of meditation and Jewish mysticism. One of his students once asked him, if we yearn to return so much, why did we ever separate? And he answered, well, the separation that we feel teaches us a wisdom that we would never have learned if we'd always been in the oneness. And then we become part of the movement of all creation back into the oneness. And we bring back the wisdom that we learned on our journey from our days, from the people and all the places in this world. And we're striving back to oneness, but from a place of knowledge and wisdom, and a place of trying to gather a little bit more awareness and individual experience. And from our personal journey of discovering the self of all selves, always ever seeking to return to the Holy of Holies, to return to our true home. And so during the last few weeks of the high holidays, we have tried to remove all those barriers that stand in the way of each and all of our inner journey of contentment, of connection, and of return, trying to wipe away all the anger, all the resentment, all the grievance, all the jealousy, everything that might get in the way of being present in the moment, of experiencing the eternal now, which is the only place to ever truly exist, of living and doing our best to be, to work in this world at our fullest. And we each do the best we can, whatever way we can. We try and surround ourselves with the people who will accompany us through the journey, the people who will share the lessons we've learned along the way. And then that voyage of birth and death carries us back to our source, to the divine, to the oneness of all being, to Adonai, the Holy One of Israel. Good Yantiv.